Looking at the expenses of the Second World War from scratch, how many countries did Japan actually invade? After occupying more than half of China, how did Japan end up defeated? Japan was a militaristic country. Foreign aggression and expansion were their principles. As Japan's domestic economy declined, in 1931, Japan launched the Mukden Incident in northeast China. The Japanese invaders destroyed their own transportation facilities, and falsely blamed our country for it, using this as an excuse to initiate the invasion of China. Under the nationalist government's policy of non-resistance, China's northeast 3 provinces were quickly occupied by Japanese troops, and established as the puppet state of Manchukuo. The industrial output of the northeast 3 provinces accounted for 60% of China's, which facilitated Japan's subsequent invasion of China, provided a continuous stream of resources. At the same time, the Japanese military also carried out sweeping reforms, and began large-scale recruitment. By 1936, the Japanese army had reached 1.2 million troops, and signed the Axis Pact with Germany. From then on, Japan joined the fascist camp. Advance. Japan's goal is to conquer Asia. In 1937, Japan successively occupied places like Hebei and Tianjin, and began eyeing Beijing, as the next target. On July 7, Japan launched the long-planned Marco Polo Bridge incident, marking the full outbreak of the War of Resistance against Japan. As Chinese cities fell under Japanese occupation, Western countries began to strongly condemn Japan's invasion actions, but the Japanese army stubbornly continued their invasion of our country. As a result, many Western nations started to ban the export of oil to Japan. In September 1939, Japan, in order to obtain more strategic resources, began to march northward and invade the Soviet Union, and the Battle of Kokken-Gioel erupted, which ended in a Japanese defeat. This also led to 100,000 Japanese prisoners of war being forced into labor in the Siberian region of the Soviet Union. With Nazi Germany achieving unstoppable victories in Europe, Japan was unwilling to lag behind, so they set their next invasion target on the Southeast Asian region. Under the attack of the Japanese Navy, Vietnam and the Philippines, Indonesia and other countries, all suffered invasions by the Japanese army. On September 26, 1940, Japan signed the Axis Pact with Germany and Italy, which was opposed by the United States, so the Americans banned oil exports to Japan. The export of strategic resources like iron and steel was to ensure the supply of war resources. Japan further expanded its invasion. They aimed to establish a Pan-Asian prosperity zone. Within this, the invasion of China was considered crucial by Japan. In Japan, many young people and intellectuals were brainwashed to promote their militarist path. Japan established many military academies to expand their military strength, with the goal of controlling all of Asia and the Pacific, aiming to establish hegemony, and appointing Hirohito as the supreme leader, as a propagandist for militarism, and deifying and worshipping him, and instilling cult-like thought. Regarding this, many Japanese officers and soldiers are willing to dedicate themselves to it, even willing to face life-threatening situations without hesitation. Although Japan suffered setbacks in the Soviet Union region, Japan's invasion of East Asia and Southeast Asia achieved significant results, from Myanmar to Vietnam, then to the Philippines and Indonesia, including most of the Pacific region, had already fallen into Japan's clutches. In order to launch further invasions, Japan spent a great deal of time developing its navy, and built the largest battleship in history, the Yamato then. These naval aircraft and vessels, distributed across various regions of Southeast Asia, due to Japan's long-term resistance from the United States, Japan's highest naval commander, Yamamoto Isoroku, decided to carry out a groundbreaking plan. That was to launch a surprise attack on the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor. The goal was to deal a heavy blow to the U.S. Navy, no kidding, and to make America lose its dominance in the Pacific. Japan aimed to dominate the entire Pacific region with this. On December 7, 1941, Japan deployed 6 aircraft carriers with 440 planes to launch an attack on the U.S. military base at Pearl Harbor. Because the U.S. forces were unprepared, during several hours of the Japanese assault, American casualties exceeded 3,000. 12 battleships and 180 aircraft were destroyed, and Japan suffered the loss of over 100 soldiers and 31 aircraft. The next day, U.S. President Franklin D. Roosevelt declared war on Japan. World War II reached its largest scale. Subsequently, Japan also attacked the Philippines, Malaya, and other Southeast Asian countries. They launched a sweeping offensive, especially in the Malay Peninsula. Under Yamamoto's leadership, the Japanese army took only 60 days to defeat the British force of 200,000. They drove them out of the Malay Peninsula. Although Japan had a series of victories, they were soon dealt a heavy blow by the United States. America's revenge firestorm was already underway. On April 18, 1942, the American Bumblebee has quietly crossed the Pacific region, and successfully carried out an airstrike in Tokyo, Japan. This operation was called the Dullet Air Raid. 16 bombers went to target military sites within Japan. Later, these U.S. pilots were forced to stop in the Jiangsu, Zhejiang, and Shanghai regions of China. However, Japan carried out a carpet search to retaliate against these U.S. forces. During this time, many innocent civilians were killed. During this period, many innocent civilians were killed. 1 month later, Japan engaged in the Battle of the Coral Sea against the British-American Allied forces in eastern Indonesia. The Allies won this battle. The Japanese forces suffered a Waterloo. The plan for Japan to invade Australia was foiled. To reverse the situation, Yamamoto Isoroku wanted to establish new military bases and continue to strike the U.S. ports in Hawaii. To do this, he aimed to decisively confront the U.S. around Midway Island. In fact, Japan greatly overestimated its military strength. June 4, 1942, the Battle of Midway broke out. During this battle, the Japanese lost 4 aircraft carriers and 350 aircraft. A total of 3,100 enemy personnel were killed. This battle was also a turning point in the Pacific War, dealing a heavy blow to Japan's Pacific Fleet. Due to years of continuous fighting, material shortages, most of Japan's military equipment had not been updated or replaced, and the focus of military development began shifting from the army to the navy. This also caused the Japanese army to switch from offense to defense. The Japanese army was eager to produce equipment, so the Japanese army bet everything on spending all their money on naval and air force development. But even then, it was far from enough. December 1942, the U.S. military launched an attack on Guadalcanal Island against the Japanese forces. Because the Japanese were poorly equipped, a large number of Japanese Navy ships were sunk here. The victory began to tilt in America's favor. In 1943, the U.S. military began attacking the Gilbert and Marshall Islands. Under the overwhelming firepower of the U.S. forces, the Japanese suffered heavy losses. They began to retreat in disarray. In the 1944 Philippines campaign, in what was the largest carrier versus carrier battle in history, the Japanese were completely overwhelmed. Since then, the Japanese Navy was doomed. Immediately afterward, the United States launched a strategic operation against the Mariana Islands. Under the overwhelming firepower of the U.S. military, Japan suffered huge losses. At the same time, Japan was also deeply trapped in the war in China. The Nationalist Army's major counteroffensive had already begun. Then, Japan suffered another defeat at the Battle of Leyte Gulf. July 1944, during the Battle of Saipan, the Japanese army launched a suicidal charge, but it was all in vain. In this battle, the U.S. forces eliminated all Japanese troops on the island, a total of over 40,000 soldiers. 1945 was the final turning point in the Pacific War. As we saw in March, the United States dispatched over 400 bombers to carry out the bombing raids on Tokyo, Japan. Statistically, over 100,000 Little Devils were killed in this bombing. Another million civilians were left homeless. March 1945, the fiercest battle in the Pacific, the Battle of Okinawa, breaks out. In this battle, American forces suffered over 80,000 casualties, while Japanese casualties reached 120,000. The Japanese forces were nearly wiped out. At the same time, Japan's Second Fleet began launching suicide attacks against the American forces. However, this news was quickly intercepted by American intelligence. Despite the kamikaze attacks, the U.S. Fifth Fleet, with its powerful firepower, sank the Japanese battleship Yamamoto and 9 other warships. July 26, 1945. At the Potsdam Conference, the leaders of the US, Soviet Union, and Britain demanded Japan's unconditional surrender. This was rejected by Japan. With the agreement of both Britain and the United States, the US dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima. 3 days later, the US dropped another atomic bomb on Nagasaki. These 2 atomic bombs caused approximately 300,000 casualties in Japan. On August 15, 1945, Japan announced its unconditional surrender. The Second World War officially came to an end.